Long before the golden treasures of ancient Egypt were sealed in tombs or placed in the hands of pharaohs, someone had to dig them from the earth. Someone had to wake in the darkness, cross the desert, and chip away at stone beneath the burning sun. In this quiet corner of history, far from the glory and monuments, we'll step into the forgotten world of those who endured the desert's silence to serve a kingdom of gods. So welcome, and get ready for a soothing adventure. If you enjoy calming, late-night journeys through history like this one, you might consider subscribing. I make these long bedtime documentaries to help you drift off while still learning something new. The first thing you feel is not the heat, but the cold. It is a deep, ancient cold that has settled into the stones and into your bones during the brief, star-dusted hours of the desert night. There is no gentle dawn here, no soft transition from slumber to wakefulness, no gradual lightening of the world. There is only the sudden absence of sleep, a stark awareness that returns to you in the immense, pre-dawn silence of the eastern desert. You open your eyes, but the darkness is so complete it feels like a physical weight pressing down on them, a velvet shroud that smothers sight. The air you breathe is thin and sharp, tasting of stone dust and the faint, metallic tang of your own exhaustion. Around you, the shapes of other men are beginning to stir, their movements slow and stiff, accompanied by the soft, involuntary groans of bodies that have found no real rest on the hard-packed earth and rock that serves as a communal bed. Each jutting stone has left its imprint on your flesh, a dull ache that promises to be the foundation for the sharper pains of the day to come. This is not a home. It is a temporary scar on the face of an eternal landscape, a camp carved from the raw material of its own desolation, a place that exists for a single, all-consuming purpose. You are not a man here. You are a tool, an instrument of the Pharaoh's will, and the day's work is about to begin. A shout from the perimeter breaks the stillness, the harsh crack of a human voice against the stone, a sound as sharp and unforgiving as a whip. It is the overseer, his silhouette a darker patch against the deep indigo of the eastern sky, a man whose authority is as absolute as the desert itself. The order is not a word, but a sound of command, a guttural bark that ripples through the huddled forms, bringing everyone to their feet with the practiced immediacy of fear. There is no conversation, no morning greeting, only the rustle of coarse linen kilts and the soft, weary shuffle of bare, calloused feet on grit. You move towards the fire, a small, precious flicker of warmth in the vast cold, its light catching the weary lines on the faces of the men around you. They are a mosaic of the known world, a collection of the empire's vanquished and unwanted, broad-shouldered Nubians whose dark skin seems to absorb the shadows, their faces stoic masks. Wiry Libyans with eyes that still hold the memory of green lands, a haunted look of disbelief that they should find themselves here. And men from the heart of Egypt itself, their faces familiar, but hardened by this unforgiving place, their crime not treason, but poverty or debt. Some are prisoners of war, their crime the defense of their homeland. Others are criminals from the towns along the Nile, their sentence not a quick death, but this slow, grinding erasure. You do not know their stories, and they do not know yours. Here the past is a luxury, a heavy stone that was discarded long ago. There is only the shared reality of the present, a bond forged not in camaraderie, but in common misery. A ration is pushed into your hand. It is the same as yesterday, and the same as it will be tomorrow. A disk of hard, gritty flatbread, dense and dry, and a ladle of water from a clay jar. The bread is made from emmer wheat, its flour contaminated with the fine sand that gets into everything, so that every bite is an act of grinding your own teeth down. You chew slowly, methodically, your jaw aching with the effort, forcing it down. This is not food for pleasure. It is fuel for the labor to come, a calculated measure of energy to be expended in the Pharaoh's service. You drink the water with the same careful deliberation, letting it soothe the raw dust in your throat, knowing it will be many hours before you taste it again. The water itself is lukewarm, tasting faintly of the clay jar and the distance it has traveled to reach this desolate place. Some of the older men murmur a brief prayer, their heads bowed towards the east, where the sun god Ra will soon begin his fiery journey across the sky. It is a prayer of habit, a plea for protection in the dark places of the earth, a whispered hope that the gods have not forgotten them in this forsaken land, so far from the life-giving Nile. But there is no priest here to offer blessings, no grand temple to receive their prayers. Their faith is as stripped down and essential as their lives, a private ember glowing in the face of an overwhelming darkness. With the ration consumed, you move to collect your tools. They are not the elegant, bronze instruments of a craftsman in Thebes, but the crude, brutal implements of extraction, tools of deconstruction. Your hammer is a heavy, rounded dolerite stone, its surface smoothed by the hands of countless men before you, a leather thong wrapped around it for grip. It has no haft, no handle to absorb the shock of impact. The shock will travel directly from the stone, up your arm, and into your shoulder, a jarring percussion that will echo through your body all day. Your chisels are made of copper, a metal soft enough that its edge will blunt and curl after only a few dozen strikes against the hard quartz. You are given a handful of them, knowing that each will become useless in turn, a testament to the futility of soft metal against hard stone. And finally, there is the basket, woven from palm fibers, rough against your skin. It is your measure of worth. Your day is measured in the number of times you can fill this basket with shattered rock and haul it to the surface. It is a small, fragile thing, yet it feels impossibly heavy before the day has even begun, its weight not in its material, but in the labor it represents. The procession to the mine begins. You walk in a long, silent line, a column of ghosts moving through the twilight, flanked by guards carrying spears and whips. They are Egyptians like some of the miners, but their faces are set with a different kind of hardness, the hardness of authority. They do not speak to you. They are there to ensure the pharaoh's will is done, to prevent escape into a desert that would kill you anyway, and to enforce the pace of the work. The sun is now cresting the jagged peaks of the distant mountains, and its first rays are not gentle. They are fierce and white-hot, instantly beginning to bake the air. The landscape around you is a study in brutal majesty. This is the Wadi Hammamat, the great valley of rock that connects the Nile to the Red Sea. It is a place of ghosts and gods, its cliffs carved with the inscriptions of expeditions stretching back 1,000 years, boasts of kings and lists of officials who passed this way. But you do not see the history. You see only rock, endless and indifferent, shimmering in the growing heat, a world of granite and silence. The entrance to the mine is a dark mouth in the side of a cliff, a wound in the earth. The air that breathes from it is stale and warm, thick with the smell of pulverized stone and human sweat. You descend into the darkness, your eyes struggling to adjust, leaving the world of light and sun behind. The only light comes from the small, sputtering flames of linseed oil lamps placed in niches along the tunnel walls. Their light is feeble, casting long, dancing shadows that make the rock walls seem to writhe and shift, a disorienting, hellish ballet of light and dark. The tunnel is narrow, forcing you to stoop, your shoulders scraping against the rough-hewn stone. It twists and turns, following the erratic path of a quartz vein, a milky white ribbon trapped within the darker granite. This vein is your entire world. It is the reason for this camp, for your suffering, for the existence of this place. Within this worthless-looking stone lies the prize, the nebu, the gold, the very flesh of the gods. You find your spot along the vein, a cramped space between two other men. There is no room for wasted movement. You take your first copper chisel, place its tip against a fissure in the quartz, and raise the heavy stone hammer. The first blow lands with a deafening crack, a sound that is instantly swallowed by the close confines of the tunnel. The shock jolts through your arm, a familiar pain that you have learned to ignore. You strike again, and again, and again. A rhythm establishes itself, a grim cadence of labor. Strike, turn the chisel, strike again. A small crack appears. You work at it, your breath coming in short, dusty gasps. The air is thick with rock dust, a fine powder that coats your skin, fills your nostrils, and lines your throat and lungs. You can feel it building inside you, a slow petrification from within, turning your living tissue to stone. The copper chisel deforms, its edge now uselessly round. You toss it aside and grab another, not breaking the rhythm. The sweat pours from your body, plastering your linen kilt to your skin, carving clean channels through the grime on your face. But the sweat offers no relief. The air in the tunnel is too hot and stagnant for it to cool you. It is merely the body weeping water it cannot afford to lose. Hours pass. Time in the mine is not measured by the sun, but by the dulling of chisels, the ache in your back, and the searing thirst that becomes a constant, raging fire in your throat. Your world shrinks to the few inches of rock in front of you. You are no longer a man with a past or a future. You are an extension of the hammer, a machine of percussion. Your mind empties of all thought except the immediate task. Find the crack, place the chisel, strike the stone. Occasionally, a larger chunk of quartz breaks free. The sound is a small victory. You gather the sharp-edged fragments with your bare hands, your fingers already calloused and cut, and place them carefully into your basket. You can see the faint, almost invisible specks glittering within the white stone, and for a moment you understand. This is what the pharaoh wants. This is the substance of eternity, the divine metal that will adorn his tomb and the statues of the gods, ensuring his immortality. You are chipping away at the bones of the desert to build a bridge to the afterlife for a king you will never meet. When your basket is full, the second part of your labor begins. You hoist it onto your shoulder, the rough fibers digging into your skin, and begin the slow, agonizing journey back to the surface. The weight is immense, and your legs, cramped from hours of squatting, tremble with the strain. You navigate the dark, twisting tunnels, your body contorting to fit through the narrow passages. You pass other men on their way down, their faces grim masks of dust and shadow. There is no camaraderie, no shared encouragement. Each man is an island of suffering, locked in his own private battle against the rock and his own failing body. As you near the entrance, the distant square of light grows, first a pinprick, then a blinding white glare. You emerge from the darkness into the full, brutal force of the midday sun. The heat is a physical blow. The light is so intense it feels like needles in your eyes. The world outside is a furnace, the rocks too hot to touch, the air a shimmering wave of heat rising from the valley floor. You carry your basket to the crushing station, a flat, open area where a different kind of labor is underway. Here, women and older children sit in the merciless sun, their bodies wrapped in rags. They take the chunks of quartz you have brought and begin the painstaking process of reducing them to powder. They use smaller stone grinders, rocking them back and forth, their movements as rhythmic and monotonous as your own. Their faces are hidden by shadows and dust, but you can see the strain in their arms, the slow, methodical nature of their toil. This is a family affair, a multi-generational commitment to the pharaoh's wealth. You dump your rock onto the pile, the sound a sharp clatter in the heat-drenched silence. You do not speak to them. You take a moment to stretch your back, the muscles screaming in protest, and then you turn and head back towards the dark mouth of the mine. There is no rest, your basket is empty. It must be filled again. The afternoon is a blur of repeated agony. The heat in the mine intensifies as the rock outside bakes in the sun. The air becomes almost unbreathable. Men begin to falter. You hear a cry from further down the tunnel, followed by the sharp crack of a whip and a scream of pain. A man has collapsed from exhaustion, and the guards are there to remind him that the pharaoh's work does not pause for human weakness. You keep your head down, focusing on your own small patch of rock. You have learned that survival in this place depends on making yourself invisible, on becoming a ghost before you are dead. You must not draw the attention of the overseers. You must simply endure. You fill your basket again and again. Each journey to the surface feels longer than the last, your body a symphony of aches, your mind a dull, throbbing void. Finally, as the sun begins its descent, casting long, stark shadows across the valley, the call comes to end the day's work. You emerge from the mine for the last time, a creature of dust and sweat, blinking in the softer, golden light of the evening. The heat is still immense, but its fiercest edge has gone. You return your tools, your body moving with the slow, deliberate motions of utter exhaustion. The evening meal is the same as the morning's. A disk of bread, a ladle of water, perhaps a few dried dates if the caravan has been recent. You eat without tasting, your body craving the fuel. As twilight settles, a deep purple cloak over the mountains, you find your place on the stone ground. There is no comfort here, no softness. You lie down, your muscles twitching and cramping, your bones aching with a weariness that feels as if it has settled into your very marrow. Around you, the camp is quiet. The silence is different from the pre-dawn silence. It is not tense with anticipation, but heavy with depletion. You listen to the sounds of the desert night beginning its life. The wind whispers through the rocks, a low, mournful sigh. Somewhere in the distance, a jackal cries, its call a lonely, haunting sound. You close your eyes, but sleep does not come easily. You see the quartz vein behind your eyelids. You feel the phantom shock of the hammer in your arm. You are buried in the dust of this place, your life being ground down, particle by particle, just like the rock you shatter, all to produce a few glittering flakes of a metal you will never touch, for a god-king you will never see, in the service of an eternity you will never share. The man who swings the stone hammer in the suffocating darkness of the mine is a ghost in his own time, an anonymous figure defined only by his toil. But he was not born a ghost. He had a name, a home, a life, before the desert claimed him. To understand the immense, brutal machinery of ancient Egypt's gold production, we must look past the dust and the darkness and ask a fundamental question. Who were these people? Who were the thousands of souls condemned to this living death, their identities erased, their labor fueling the divine splendor of an empire? The answer is not a simple one. The workforce of the pharaoh's mines was not a monolith, but a carefully stratified collection of the lost, the conquered, and the condemned. They were the human cost of eternity, a hidden population whose suffering was the dark bedrock upon which the golden age of the gods was built. They were not, for the most part, willing participants. The gold mines of the eastern desert and Nubia were not places of opportunity, but destinations of finality. They were the ancient world's equivalent of a gulag, a penal colony from which there was rarely any return. The primary source of this disposable labor came from the spoils of war. With every successful military campaign, the pharaoh's armies would return not only with plunder, but with people. Thousands of prisoners of war would be marched in chains from distant lands, from Libya, from Syria, from the Levant, and most especially from Nubia to the south. For many of these captives, their fate was not to be integrated into Egyptian society as servants or farmhands, but to be sent directly to the state's most punishing enterprises. The mines were a perfect destination for these men. They were strong, they were already organized into groups, and their lives were considered utterly expendable. An inscription from the reign of Ramesses II speaks of sending captives to the gold mines as a matter of course, a routine administrative decision. For a captured soldier, the terror of battle was replaced by the slow, grinding horror of the mines, a life sentence of hard labor in a land that was not his own, in the service of a king who had conquered his people. Alongside the prisoners of war quelled Egypt's own domestic undesirables. The Egyptian legal system, the Code of Ma'at, was one of order and balance, but its punishments could be severe. For crimes deemed especially disruptive to the social order, tomb robbing, sedition, chronic debt, or repeated theft, the sentence was often exile to the mines. This was considered a fate worse than death. It was a complete severance from the fabric of Egyptian life, a banishment from the fertile, ordered world of the Nile Valley to the chaotic, sterile world of the desert. A man sentenced to the mines lost everything: his family, his property, his name, and his place in his community. He was, in a legal and social sense, already dead. The classical historian Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries later but drawing on earlier accounts, gives a harrowing description of these condemned men. He speaks of them being sent to the mines in great numbers, bound in fetters, forced to work day and night without respite. He emphasizes that there was no hope of pardon or escape, that they were worked until their bodies gave out and they died in the midst of their labors. This was not just punishment, it was a form of human alchemy, transforming a problematic citizen into a productive, if temporary, asset for the state. It is crucial to distinguish this workforce from the men who built the Great Pyramids centuries earlier. The pyramid builders of the Old Kingdom, as archaeological evidence from their settlements has shown, were not slaves in the modern sense. They were a conscripted but respected workforce of Egyptian laborers. They lived in organized towns, received regular and nutritious rations of bread, beer, and meat, had access to medical care, and were buried with honor near the sacred monuments they had built. Theirs was a form of national service, a sacred duty. The gold miners of the New Kingdom and later periods occupied a far lower rung on the ladder of human value. Their work was not seen as a sacred construction project, but as a punitive and extractive industry. Their camps were not towns, but fortified prisons. Their rations were calculated for bare subsistence, their medical care was likely minimal, and their deaths were unrecorded, their bodies left to the desert. The pyramid builders were creating a stairway to heaven for their king. The gold miners were toiling in a version of hell on earth. Within this hierarchy of suffering, the Nubians held a special and tragic place. Nubia, the land to the south of Egypt, was known from the earliest times as Tar Seti, the land of the bow, but it had another name, Nebu, the land of gold. The deserts of Nubia were even richer in gold than those of Egypt, and for millennia, the pharaohs sought to control this resource through conquest and colonization. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia was complex, a long history of trade, cultural exchange, and brutal military domination. During the New Kingdom, Egypt colonized Nubia, building massive temples and fortresses and appointing viceroys to rule the territory. The extraction of Nubian gold became a cornerstone of the Egyptian economy, the fuel for its international diplomacy and imperial splendor. Consequently, the Nubian people were systematically exploited for their labor. Many of the miners were Nubian locals, forced to work in the mines that had been carved into their own ancestral lands. They were joined by those Nubians captured in the constant rebellions against Egyptian rule. For the Egyptians, the dark-skinned Nubians were often depicted as a subjugated people, their role to serve the interests of the pharaoh. In the mines, this racial and colonial hierarchy was brutally enforced. They were the conquered, digging the wealth of their own land out from under their feet to be shipped north and adorn the palaces and temples of their conquerors. Life within the mining camps was governed by a strict and clear hierarchy, a microcosm of the Egyptian state itself, but stripped of all its grace and complexity. At the very bottom were the laborers, the vast, anonymous mass of prisoners, criminals and conscripts. Above them were the guards, the military arm of the operation. These were Egyptian soldiers, often veterans, tasked with maintaining discipline and preventing any thought of rebellion or escape. They were armed and received better rations, living separately from the main workforce. Their tool was the whip, and their authority was absolute. The threat of immediate and brutal physical punishment was a constant presence, the primary motivator in a system that offered no other incentive. Overseeing the entire operation was a small class of administrators. At the top was the overseer, a high-ranking official appointed by the pharaoh or his vizier. He was the captain of the host, the commander of the expedition, responsible for meeting the gold quotas set by the crown. His name might be inscribed on a stela near the mine, a proud declaration of his service to the king. Beneath him were the scribes. In a civilization obsessed with record-keeping, the scribes were indispensable. They were the literate elite of the camp, their tools the palette and the reed brush. They meticulously recorded everything: the number of workers, the distribution of rations, the weight of the ore extracted each day, the amount of gold dust produced, the number of tools broken, the number of men who died. They were the accountants of this human misery. Their papyrus rolls a cold, dispassionate ledger of the camp's productivity. Their presence tells us that this was not a chaotic free-for-all, but a highly organized, state-controlled industrial operation. The social distance between a scribe and a miner was as vast as the distance between Thebes and the desert. The scribe lived in better quarters, ate better food, and was not subject to the back-breaking labor. He was a bureaucrat, a representative of the ordered world of the Nile, observing and recording the chaotic toil of the underworld. The existence of this administrative class highlights the profound class divide that defined the enterprise. The suffering was not shared equally. It was borne almost entirely by the men at the bottom, the men whose names were never recorded, who were counted not as individuals, but as units of labor in a scribe's tally. They were the invisible workforce, hidden away in the desert, their existence a closely guarded state secret. The glittering gold that emerged from this process was presented to the world as a divine gift, a manifestation of the pharaoh's power and his connection to the gods. The story of its origin, the tales of the prisoners of war, the condemned criminals, the enslaved Nubians, the whips of the overseers, and the slow death in the dust-choked tunnels, was a story that was never meant to be told. It was buried in the desert, along with the bones of the men who lived it. The gold that adorned the pharaoh's death mask and lined the walls of the gods' sanctuaries was not born of the fertile black earth of the Nile Valley. It was not a product of the predictable, life-affirming cycles of inundation and harvest that defined Egyptian civilization. It was a child of a different, harsher world, a substance wrested from the very bones of the desert. To find the source of this divine metal, one had to turn away from the life-giving river, from Kemet, the Black Land, and journey eastward, into the vast, sun-scorched wilderness that lay between the Nile and the Red Sea. This was the Desert, the Red Land, a place of profound silence, extreme temperatures, and geological antiquity. It was a landscape of jagged granite mountains that cawed at a perpetually cloudless sky, of dry, ghostly riverbeds known as wadis, and of endless plains of sand and rock that shimmered with mirages. To the ancient Egyptians, this was a liminal space, a dangerous and chaotic realm outside the ordered cosmos of their riverine civilization. It was the domain of Seth, the god of storms and chaos, a place where the rules of Ma'at, of divine order and balance, felt thin and fragile. Yet within this hostile domain, hidden in veins of white quartz that snaked through the mountains like frozen lightning, lay the glittering prize that the emperor craved above all others. The quest for gold was therefore more than an industrial enterprise. It was a journey into the heart of desolation, an immense logistical undertaking that pushed the limits of human endurance and ancient engineering, a spiritual battle to impose the pharaoh's order upon a chaotic land. The primary gold-producing region within Egypt's traditional borders was this eastern desert. A network of mines, some small, others vast industrial complexes, was scattered throughout its arid mountain ranges, concentrated in areas where millennia of geological activity had forced gold-bearing quartz to the surface. One of the most significant of these regions was the Wadi Hammamat, a great, dry valley that served as a natural corridor from the Nile city of Coptos to the Red Sea coast. This was not just a mining area. It was a major trade and expeditionary route, and its rock faces are an immense, open-air archive covered in thousands of inscriptions left by the generations of men who passed through. These graffiti and formal stelae, left by quarry masters, army commanders and scribes, paint a picture of a landscape that was actively and continuously exploited by the state. They record massive expeditions, numbering in the thousands of men, sent out to quarry prized decorative stone like beacon stone for temples, and more secretly, to extract the precious gold. Further south, stretching towards the border with Nubia, was the Wadi al-Aki. This was an even more remote and forbidding region, a vast drainage basin that was notoriously difficult to supply with water, a place where the sun's heat was trapped between the cliffs, creating a furnace-like environment. Yet it was incredibly rich in gold. The Egyptians' approach to this landscape was not haphazard. The Turin Papyrus map, the oldest surviving geological map in the world, dating to the reign of Ramesses IV, depicts a section of the Wadi Hammamat with astonishing detail. It shows the location of gold mines, workers' settlements, roads, and even distinguishes between different types of rock, with different colors and labels. This remarkable document reveals the systematic and scientific approach the Egyptians took to their mining operations. They were not simply stumbling upon gold. They were mapping, surveying, and exploiting the landscape with a high degree of geological knowledge. The map even notes the location of a well, a source of water so critical that its inclusion was as important as the location of the gold itself. This underscores the central, life-or-death challenge of all desert mining operations, the problem of water. An expedition into the eastern desert was a monumental logistical feat. It required months of planning, the gathering of immense resources, and the organization of a vast support structure. The journey began not in the desert, but in the bustling cities of the Nile. Thousands of donkeys, the resilient backbone of all desert transport, would be assembled. They would be laden with everything the expedition would need for months of isolation. Sacks of grain for bread, jars of beer and water, dried fish, dates, tools, weapons and pottery. A large military escort was essential, not only to guard the workers, but also to protect the caravan from raids by the nomadic desert tribes, the Medjay, who, while sometimes employed by the Egyptians as elite police, also viewed these resource-rich expeditions as tempting targets. The journey itself was perilous. The caravans moved slowly across the scorched terrain, navigating by the stars and the intimate knowledge of experienced desert guides who could read the subtle language of the landscape. The sun was a relentless enemy, and the risk of dehydration and heatstroke was constant. Many men and animals would perish along the way, their bones left to be bleached by the sun, a silent testament to the dangers of the journey. Upon reaching the designated mining area, the first task was to establish a fortified camp. These were not temporary tent cities, they were permanent, defensible settlements built from the surrounding stone. Archaeological remains of these camps reveal a highly organized layout. They were often enclosed by thick stone walls, with watchtowers and well-guarded gates. Inside, the structures were simple and functional. Rows of small, stone huts for the workers, often no more than circular shelters, offering minimal protection from the elements. Larger, more complex quarters for the overseers and soldiers, administrative buildings for the scribes, workshops for blacksmiths to sharpen and repair the soft copper tools, and heavily protected storehouses for the rations, and most importantly, for the extracted gold. These were isolated outposts of Egyptian authority in a hostile wilderness, self-contained worlds governed by rigid military discipline. The work of finding and extracting the gold was only half the battle. The true wealth of the empire, however, lay even further south, beyond the traditional borders of Egypt, in the land of Nubia. The deserts of Nubia were legendary for their gold deposits, and the region was coveted and controlled by Egypt for this very reason. During the New Kingdom, the pharaohs treated Nubia as a colonial territory, and the extraction of its gold was a primary objective of their rule. The Viceroy of Kush, the pharaoh's chief administrator in Nubia, was responsible for sending a massive annual tribute of gold back to the royal court in Thebes. Tomb inscriptions of high officials from this period, like that of Hai, often depict long processions of Nubians bearing this tribute, their arms laden with rings of pure gold, sacks of gold dust, and elaborate golden vessels. These images were a form of political propaganda, a visual declaration of Egypt's domination over its gold-rich neighbor, presenting a sanitized and orderly transfer of wealth. The reality was far harsher. The mining operations in Nubia were even larger and more difficult than those in the eastern desert. The distances were greater, the climate was harsher, and the local populations were often hostile to their Egyptian overlords, leading to frequent rebellions which were brutally suppressed. The journey to the Nubian goldfields was a long and arduous one, often involving a combination of travel by ship up the Nile to the point of the cataracts, and then long overland treks by donkey caravan deep into the desert. Here too, the Egyptians established fortified settlements and organized the local workforce, often supplemented with prisoners and criminals from Egypt, into a vast industrial machine. An inscription from the reign of Seti I describes the hardships of the Nubian mines with remarkable candor. It speaks of a road where water was scarce, where travelers perished of thirst, their mouths parched. It recounts the pharaoh's decision to command the digging of a great well along the route, to provide water for the gold miners and the caravans. The inscription presents this as an act of benevolent kingship, the pharaoh providing for his people. But it also reveals the deadly reality of the enterprise. Before the well was dug, how many thousands had died on that road? The inscription is a testament not only to the pharaoh's power, but to the immense human cost that was accepted as a necessary price for the acquisition of gold. The suffering of the miners was not an unknown or hidden fact. It was acknowledged, even by the state itself, as an integral part of the process. The tomb of Hai, the viceroy of Kush under Tutankhamun, contains vivid scenes that hint at the reality of the mines. While the main scenes show orderly processions of tribute, smaller details depict the hardship. We see figures toiling under the watchful eyes of overseers, their bodies bent with labor. The art is stylized and formal, but the message is clear. The divine gold that reached the pharaoh was the product of immense, organized, and often brutal human effort. It was not simply found. It was extracted, at a cost measured in sweat, blood, and lives. From the rocky wadis of the eastern desert to the scorched plains of Nubia, the pharaoh's search for gold created a vast network of extraction, a hidden empire of mines and camps that stretched across thousands of square miles of the world's most inhospitable terrain. It was an industry built on the edge of what was humanly possible, a testament to the organizational genius of the Egyptian state, and its utter ruthlessness in the pursuit of the metal it considered the very substance of the gods. The story of gold in ancient Egypt is a profound paradox, a tale of two irreconcilable worlds. One world is the one we have just left, a world of dust and thirst, of brutal labor in the suffocating darkness of the earth, a world of human suffering on an industrial scale. The other world is one of divine light, of serene gods and eternal kings, of sacred spaces that gleam with an otherworldly, incorruptible splendor. These two worlds, the profane and the sacred, the mortal and the divine, seem utterly separate. Yet they are bound together by the very substance that defined them both. The gold that was wrested from the desert by the hands of condemned men was not destined for the marketplace. It was not a currency for buying bread or land. It was a holy substance, a material with a cosmic significance so profound that no amount of human suffering was considered too high a price for its acquisition. To understand why the pharaohs would move mountains and sacrifice thousands of lives, we must understand the sacred grammar of gold. We must see it not as a metal, but as a message from the gods, the very stuff of eternity. In the Egyptian mind, gold, or nebu, was not simply a beautiful, rare, and valuable material. It was the physical manifestation of the divine. Its primary characteristic was its incorruptibility. While copper tarnished, wood rotted, and stone could crumble, gold remained unchanged. It did not rust, decay, or lose its luster. It was eternal, a perfect physical analogue for the unending nature of the gods and the afterlife. Its warm, radiant gleam was not just a reflection of light, but a tangible piece of the sun itself. Gold was believed to be the very skin, the flesh of the gods. The sun god Ra, the supreme deity and the father of the pharaohs, was said to have a body of pure gold. When the gods walked the earth, their skin was not like that of mortals. It shone with the imperishable light of Nebu. To touch gold was to touch the substance of divinity. To possess, it was to hold a piece of the eternal cosmos in one's hand. This belief permeated every aspect of Egyptian religious life. It explains why the quest for gold was not merely an economic pursuit, but a sacred duty, an act of piety essential to maintaining the cosmic order, or Ma'at. The mines of the eastern desert were not just a source of wealth. They were a holy land, a place where the flesh of the gods could be harvested from the earth, and the suffering of the miners was a necessary, if unacknowledged, sacrifice in this cosmic endeavor. Nowhere was this sacred function more apparent than in the art of death. The Egyptian funerary cult was a complex and sophisticated system designed to achieve one ultimate goal: to transform the deceased, and especially the deceased pharaoh, from a mortal being into an immortal, divine entity, an Osiris. Gold was the essential catalyst in this transformation. The famous funerary mask of Tutankhamun is not merely a stunning portrait of the young king. It is a theological statement, an instrument of alchemy. By covering the face of the mummy with a mask of pure, solid gold, the artisans were not just creating a likeness. They were magically transmuting the king's flesh into the flesh of a god. The mask, weighing over 10 kilograms, ensured that the king's face would remain perfect and incorruptible for all eternity, and that when he was reborn in the afterlife, he would awaken with the golden skin of a divine being. This use of gold extended throughout the royal burial. The king's body was placed within a series of nested coffins, the innermost of which, in the case of Tutankhamun, was also crafted from solid gold. His fingers and toes were capped with golden stalls, his organs were placed in miniature golden coffins within the canopic chest, and his body was adorned with hundreds of golden amulets, each imbued with magical power to protect him on his perilous journey through the underworld. Every speck of gold dust extracted by a miner in Nubia, every flake washed from the crushed quartz, was destined for this ultimate purpose: to armor the king against the forces of decay and chaos, and to guarantee his successful merger with the gods. This divine materialism extended to the temples, the earthly homes of the gods. The cult statue of the god, which resided in the darkness of the innermost sanctuary, was often made of or covered in gold. This was the literal body of the god on earth, and it had to be made of the appropriate divine substance. The great temple of Amun-Ra at Karnak was a vast repository of gold. Its walls, obelisks and gateways were embellished with electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, which caught the sun's rays and made the entire complex blaze with light, a reflection of the sun god's power. The sacred barges, used to carry the god's statue in festival processions, were great wooden ships covered entirely in gold, magnificent vessels that seemed to float on a sea of divine light. The ritual implements used by the priests, the incense burners, the libation vessels, the offering tables, were all crafted from gold, ensuring that every interaction between the human and divine realms was mediated by this holy material. The immense quantities of gold funneled into the temple treasuries were not a sign of worldly wealth, but of devotional piety. They were offerings to sustain the gods, to keep them satisfied, and to ensure they continued to uphold the order of the cosmos. The pharaoh himself was the living bridge between the human and the divine, and his regalia was designed to visually reinforce this status. When the king appeared in public, he was a living statue of gold. He wore the great, heavy golden collars, the wesset, which covered his shoulders. His scepters, his flail and crook were made of gold. His throne was a masterpiece of gilded wood, and even his sandals were sometimes made of gold, ensuring that with every step he trod the earth as a divine being. This was not just a display of personal wealth, it was a carefully calibrated piece of political and religious theatre. The overwhelming splendor of the pharaoh's golden appearance was meant to be a direct visual manifestation of his legitimacy. It proved that he was the true son of Ra, the one who had access to and control over the divine substance. His ability to command the vast resources needed to acquire this gold was, in itself, proof of his power. The endless labor in the desert mines, the long and perilous caravan journeys, the armies of scribes and soldiers, all of this immense state effort culminated in the simple, powerful image of the king, gleaming with the light of the sun, the embodiment of divine authority on earth. It is critical to understand that in this worldview, gold was not currency. While it was used in international trade as a measure of value, with the pharaoh sending gifts of gold to other great kings in exchange for wood, silver, or diplomatic alliances, it was not used in daily life by ordinary people. The Egyptian economy was based on barter, a system of exchanging goods and services, with units of grain or copper often serving as a standard of value. A farmer would not pay for his tools with gold coins. Gold was a restricted substance, its use and possession largely controlled by the palace and the temples. It belonged to a separate, sacred economy. Its value was not in what it could buy, but in what it could become. A god's skin, a king's eternal face, a piece of the sun brought down to earth. This is why the crime of tomb robbing was considered so heinous. A tomb robber was not just a thief, he was a blasphemer. He was taking a sacred substance, dedicated to the eternal life of the king, and melting it down, converting it back into a profane commodity. He was undoing the magic, disrupting the cosmic order for his own personal gain, an act of profound sacrilege. Seen through this lens, the act of mining itself becomes a sacred quest. The expeditions sent into the desert were not just industrial ventures, they were religious missions. The men who toiled in the mines were, in a sense, the lowest order of priests in a vast, state-sponsored cult. They were performing the first, most brutal ritual in the long process of transforming raw earth into divine substance. Their suffering was a necessary, albeit invisible, part of the sacred economy. The overseers and scribes who recorded their labor were ensuring that this holy harvest was conducted with the order and efficiency befitting a divine enterprise. The gold, once extracted, was treated with reverence. It was carefully weighed, recorded, and transporting under heavy guard, not just to protect it from theft, but to protect its sanctity. When it finally arrived in the workshops of Thebes, it was handed over to another class of priests, the master craftsmen. These artisans, with their immense skill, would perform the final act of alchemy, transforming the raw dust and rings of metal into the shining forms of the gods. The entire process, from the first strike of a hammer in a dark tunnel to the final polishing of a pharaoh's death mask, was a single, continuous religious ceremony. It was a ceremony that connected the darkest, most brutal realities of human existence with the most sublime aspirations of the human spirit. The gold was the bridge, the conduit through which the sweat and suffering of thousands of forgotten mortals were transmuted into the serene, smiling eternity of a single god-king. The immense gulf between the sacred purpose of gold and the profane suffering of its acquisition was bridged by a simple, brutal, and remarkably effective technology. The extraction of the divine flesh of the gods from the bones of the desert was not a miracle, but a methodical, industrial process, a testament to ancient ingenuity and the capacity for relentless, organized labor. The tools and techniques employed by the pharaoh's miners were not complex, but they were perfectly adapted to their environment and their task. This was a technology of percussion and attrition, of fire and water, a system that relied less on sophisticated machinery and more on the inexhaustible application of human muscle and endurance. To examine these tools of toil is to understand the physical reality of the miner's world, to feel the weight of the stone in his hand, and to appreciate the clever, if cruel, science that turned living men into instruments for breaking the earth. The primary tool of the miner, the one that defined his daily existence, was the hammer. This was not a tool of precision, but of brute force. It was typically a large, rounded maul made of dolerite, a volcanic rock harder than the granite and quartz it was meant to shatter. These stone pounders were chosen for their weight and durability, some weighing as much as 5 or 6 kilograms. They were shaped by nature and refined by use, often grooved around the middle to allow a leather thong or rope to be tied for a better grip. Crucially, they had no wooden haft. The miner held the stone directly or by its short strap, meaning that every single impact, every bone-jarring collision with the rock face, sent a shockwave directly up his arm, through his shoulder, and into his spine. The work was a continuous, self-inflicted battery. The dolerite hammer was the engine of the entire operation, the first and most crucial instrument in the long process of deconstruction. Paired with the hammer was the chisel. While the Egyptians were masters of bronze, the tools used in the mines were often made of the softer, more plentiful copper. A copper chisel, when struck against hard quartz, deforms quickly. Its edge, painstakingly sharpened by a camp blacksmith, would dull, curl, and become useless after only a short period of intense work. Miners were therefore equipped with a number of these chisels, and a constant stream of blunted tools would have been making its way back to the forges for resharpening, a logistical challenge in itself. The softness of the tools meant that progress was agonizingly slow. The miner was not slicing through the rock, but gradually pulverizing it, chipping away at it flake by flake, hour after hour. The sound of the mine would have been a cacophony of these dull, metallic impacts against stone, a relentless, percussive chorus of slow destruction. For the hardest veins of granite and quartz, however, even this brutal combination of hammer and chisel was insufficient. To break the truly monolithic rock, the Egyptians employed a far more dramatic and effective technology, fire setting. This was an ancient technique, used in mining operations across the world, and it harnessed the fundamental power of thermal shock. The process began with the hauling of vast quantities of wood to the rock face, deep within the mine. This in itself was a monumental task, as wood was an incredibly scarce resource in the desert, likely brought in by the same donkey caravans that supplied the food. A large, intense fire would be built directly against the section of rock to be broken. For hours, the fire would rage, heating the stone to an extreme temperature, causing the crystalline structure of the rock to expand. The air in the tunnel would become a superheated, smoke-filled nightmare, thick with carbon monoxide and barely breathable. When the rock was deemed hot enough, the second stage of the process began. Water, another precious resource hauled into the mine at great effort, would be thrown suddenly onto the glowing rock face. The The result was a dramatic and violent reaction. The rapid cooling caused the rock to contract, creating immense internal stress that would crack and shatter the stone with explosive force. The sound would have been a deafening series of cracks and pops, and the tunnel would have filled with scalding steam. This technique was incredibly dangerous. It risked rock falls from the ceiling, severe burns, and asphyxiation from the smoke. But it was brutally effective, allowing the miners to break through sections of rock that would have been impenetrable with hand tools alone. After the rock had cooled, the miners would return to the now fractured face and use their hammers and chisels to pry away the loosened chunks of ore. Once the gold-bearing quartz was broken free and hauled to the surface in rough, woven baskets, the next stage of the process began. The work moved from the dark confines of the mine to the blinding glare of the desert sun, and the technology shifted from extraction to processing. The chunks of ore were taken to crushing stations, large, flat areas paved with stone. Here, the rock was systematically reduced to powder. This was often the work of women and children. The first stage involved breaking the large chunks into smaller, more manageable pieces with heavy stone hammers. Then came the grinding. Using stone mortars or saddle querns, a large, slightly concave base stone, and a smaller, loaf-shaped hand stone, the workers would grind the quartz fragments into a fine powder. This was monotonous, physically demanding labor, requiring hours of repetitive motion, rocking the hand stone back and forth, under the full heat of the sun. The fine, silica-rich dust would have been a constant hazard, a different but equally dangerous threat to the lungs than the dust of the mines. The goal was to reduce the rock to the consistency of fine sand, a process that required immense patience and effort. With the ore reduced to a fine powder, the final and most delicate stage of extraction could begin, separating the heavy gold from the worthless rock dust. This was achieved through washing, a process that relied on the simple principle of gravity. The powdered ore was placed on a sloping surface, which could be a specially constructed wooden table, a dressed stone slab, or even a stretched animal hide. A gentle, controlled stream of water would then be poured over the powder. This was the moment of revelation. The lighter particles of sand, dust, and crushed quartz would be washed away by the water, flowing down the slope and discarded. The gold, being 7 or 8 times heavier than the surrounding rock, would resist the flow of the water. The tiny, glittering flakes and grains would sink to the bottom and be trapped on the surface of the washing table. This process was repeated multiple times, each washing removing more of the waste material and concentrating the precious metal. It required great skill to manage the flow of water correctly. Too much, and the fine gold dust would be washed away with the tailings. Too little, and the separation would be incomplete. Water, the most precious commodity in the desert, was the key ingredient. The vast quantities needed for this process would have been brought from the nearest well, sometimes miles away, on the backs of donkeys, and would have been carefully rationed and recycled wherever possible. For the finest particles of gold dust, a final stage of separation might involve the use of fleece or other coarse cloths. The gold-rich slurry would be passed over the cloth, and the tiny, almost invisible specks of gold would become trapped in the fibers. The cloth would then be dried and burned, leaving only the pure gold behind. The entire technological process, from the first strike of a hammer to the final washing of the gold dust, was a masterpiece of practical engineering, perfectly adapted to the materials at hand. It was a system that could be implemented in the most remote and resource-poor environments on Earth. But its efficiency came at a staggering human cost. It was a technology powered not by wind or water wheels, but by human bodies, treated as disposable components in a vast, imperial machine. Every stage of the process was designed to be broken down into simple, repetitive tasks that could be performed by an unskilled, captive workforce. The ingenuity of the system lay not in its complexity, but in its brutal, relentless simplicity. The tools were basic, the methods elemental, but when combined with the organized labor of thousands of individuals, they were capable of moving mountains and producing the wealth that defined an empire. The technology of the gold mines was a clear reflection of the Egyptian worldview, a system of profound order and control, imposed upon a chaotic world, where the divine goal was so magnificent that the human cost of achieving it was a price the pharaoh was always willing to pay. The sun, a merciless tyrant for most of the day, becomes a painter in its final moments, stroking the jagged peaks of the desert mountains with hues of soft gold, rose, and deep violet. For the men returning from the mines, their bodies caked in a second skin of dust and sweat, this brief, beautiful transition marks the end of their torment. They walk not as a disciplined procession, but as a slow, shuffling herd of exhausted animals, their shoulders slumped, their tools dragging, their eyes fixed on the silhouette of the camp walls against the darkening sky. To pass through the guarded gates of the settlement is to cross a profound threshold. It is to leave the boundless, chaotic wilderness of the Red Land and enter a world of human order, however harsh and circumscribed that order may be. The camp is a prison, a place of exile and forced labor, yet as the cold desert night begins to descend, its stone walls offer a strange and paradoxical sense of sanctuary. It is a cage that keeps them in, but it is also a shell that keeps the vast, terrifying emptiness of the desert out. For a few short hours, between the end of one day's labor and the beginning of the next, this fortified island of human existence becomes a world unto itself, a place where life, stripped to its barest essentials, continues in the shadows. The work camps were not random collections of tents, but meticulously planned and constructed settlements, designed for permanence and control. Archaeological investigations of these abandoned sites, from the Wadi Hammamat to the distant mines of Nubia, reveal a remarkable consistency in their design. They were fortresses in the wilderness. The outer walls were thick, built of dry-laid, unmortared stone gathered from the surrounding landscape, often several meters high and wide enough for sentries to patrol their tops. Watchtowers were positioned at the corners, offering a commanding view of the desolate approaches, ensuring that no one could enter or, more importantly, leave without being seen. Within these formidable walls, the layout was a clear reflection of the camp's rigid social hierarchy. The quarters for the overseers, scribes, and military commanders were typically larger, rectangular structures, sometimes with multiple rooms, situated in a defensible or privileged position within the camp. But for the vast majority of the inhabitants, the miners themselves, home was a simple, circular stone hut. These structures, often only a few meters in diameter, were huddled together in dense clusters, their walls low and built of the same rough stone as the outer fortifications. Many were partially subterranean, dug a foot or two into the desert floor, to provide some insulation against both the searing heat of day and the biting cold of night. The roofs were likely made of brushwood or matting, offering minimal protection from the elements. There was no privacy. A man's life was lived in full view of his neighbors, his every movement and conversation part of the communal existence. These were not homes, they were human kennels, designed to house the maximum number of laborers in the minimum amount of space. As the last of the light fades, the camp comes alive with the quiet rituals of the evening. The central fire is stoked, its flames a welcome beacon in the growing darkness. This is the social heart of the camp, the place where the day's only real meal is distributed. The air fills with the smell of baking bread, as the rations are prepared on heated flat stones. The diet was monotonous but calculated for survival. The staple was a coarse, unleavened flatbread made from emmer wheat or barley, supplemented by a thick porridge of lentils or beans. This provided the essential carbohydrates and protein to fuel the next day's labor. Occasionally, the rations would be supplemented with dried fish brought from the Nile, or with handfuls of dates and dried figs from the oases, a welcome burst of sweetness in a bland existence. The most important supplement, however, was beer. The Egyptian diet, for both the rich and the poor, was built around bread and beer. The beer provided not only hydration and vital calories, but was also a source of B vitamins and probiotics, making it a healthier option than potentially contaminated water. For the miners, a ration of beer was a moment of profound relief. Its thick, soupy texture and slightly alcoholic content, a balm for an aching body and a weary soul. The distribution of these rations was a carefully controlled process, overseen by the ever-present scribes. Each man would line up, and the scribe, with his palette and brush, would make a mark on his papyrus roll or ostrakon, a shard of pottery, for every loaf of bread and every ladle of beer handed out. This was the cold accounting of the state, ensuring that no resource was wasted, that each man received precisely his allotted portion and no more. In this crucible of hardship, a fragile sense of community could sometimes form. Though the workforce was a disparate collection of men from different lands, speaking different languages, they were bound by a shared condition. Small groups would coalesce, often based on their origin, the Nubians keeping to themselves, the Egyptians forming their own circles. After the evening meal, they would gather close to the fires, their bodies huddled together for warmth against the plummeting desert temperature. In the hushed tones of men who were under constant surveillance, they would talk. They would speak of the homes they remembered, of the families they had lost. They would trade stories, fragments of myths from their homelands, tales of gods and heroes that offered a brief mental escape from their grim reality. Gossip was a vital currency, a way of understanding the subtle shifts in power within the camp, of knowing which guard was particularly cruel, or when a new caravan with fresh supplies was expected. Laughter, a rare and precious sound in this place, might occasionally break out, a brief spark of humanity refusing to be extinguished. These moments of connection were fleeting and fraught with suspicion. No one could ever be fully trusted, but they were essential for survival. They were a reminder that even here, on the edge of the world, they were still men, not just components in a machine. The camp was a profoundly unhealthy place, and the well-being of the workforce was a constant concern for the administration, not out of compassion, but for the sake of productivity. A sick or injured miner could not produce gold. While there was no hospital, there would have been individuals tasked with medical care. This was likely a combination of practical first aid and magical healing. A camp healer would have been skilled at setting broken bones, stitching deep cuts, and treating the myriad of injuries that were a daily occurrence in the mines. But for illnesses, scorpion stings, or snake bites, the treatment would have been magical. The healer would use amulets and recite incantations to drive out the evil spirits or poisons believed to be the cause. The line between doctor and magician was a blurry one. The presence of priests or lectors in some of the larger expeditions is recorded, their role to maintain the divine favor of the gods and to perform the necessary rituals to keep the camp safe from the chaotic forces of the desert. But despite these efforts, the mortality rate was undoubtedly horrific. The combination of extreme labor, malnutrition, unsanitary conditions, and the constant threat of accidents meant that a man's life expectancy in the mines was brutally short. The dead were not given elaborate burials. They were likely interred in shallow grave in the sand outside the camp walls, their passing noted only by a final mark in a scribe's ledger. The scribe was a figure who walked a line between two worlds. He was an agent of the state, a literate man of some standing, set apart from the manual laborers. His quarters would have been slightly better, his rations more generous. His work was not to break rocks, but to create order out of the chaos of the camp's daily life. He was the pharaoh's eyes and ears, his records providing the data needed for the entire enterprise to function. He tracked inventory, calculated production quotas, wrote reports to be sent back to the capital, and recorded the names and sentences of the condemned. He was the instrument of the system's control. Yet he was also a resident of this isolated community. He lived with the same heat, the same dust, the same profound isolation as the miners. He would have known the men not just as numbers in his ledger, but as faces, as voices. He would have witnessed their suffering firsthand, recorded their punishments, and tallied their deaths. What did he think as he sat in the shade of his hut, meticulously painting his hieroglyphs, while all around him men toiled in misery? Was he indifferent, a detached bureaucrat simply performing his duty? Or did he feel a sense of pity, a quiet horror at the human cost of the glittering dust he was accounting for? The ancient records are silent on this matter, but the scribe remains a fascinating and ambiguous figure, the educated man who chronicled a world of brutal ignorance, the keeper of the memory of those who were meant to be forgotten. As true darkness falls, the fires die down to embers, and a deep quiet settles over the camp. The immense, star-filled canopy of the desert sky becomes the camp's true ceiling. The sheer number and brilliance of the stars, unobscured by any competing light, would have been a nightly spectacle of breathtaking beauty, a stark contrast to the ugliness of life on the ground. This was the time for sleep, a brief, precious oblivion. The men would retreat to their stone huts, curling up against the cold, their bodies finding what little rest they could on the unyielding ground. The silence of the desert would reclaim the world, broken only by the sighing of the wind, the distant cry of a nocturnal animal, or the hacking cough of a man whose lungs were slowly turning to stone. In these quiet hours, the camp was a world adrift in a sea of silence, a tiny, fragile outpost of human life holding out against an overwhelming wilderness. It was a place of immense cruelty and suffering, but it was also a testament to human resilience. It was a community forged on the very edge of existence, where life was stripped down to its barest essentials. A mouthful of bread, a sip of water, a moment of shared warmth by a fire, and the brief, dreamless sleep of the utterly exhausted. The fragile community that flickered to life around the evening fires existed only by the grace of its masters. The desert work camp was, at its core, an instrument of state power, and that power was embodied in the figure of the overseer. He was the king's shadow in this desolate land, the fulcrum upon which the entire enterprise of extraction balanced. His authority was not earned through respect or charisma, but imposed through fear and the constant, looming threat of violence. Life in the mines was a relentless battle against the rock, the heat, and the body's own limitations. But it was also a psychological war, a daily negotiation with a system of absolute control designed to crush the human spirit as surely as the grinding stones crush the quartz. To understand the camp is to understand the overseer's watch, the web of discipline, punishment, and power that ensured the pharaoh's will was done, no matter the human cost. The overseer, or Emir Mesha, the captain of the host, was a man of significant standing, an official appointed directly by the court. He was not a miner who had risen through the ranks. He was a member of the elite, sent to this remote outpost to manage a critical state asset. His primary, and indeed only, responsibility was to meet the production quotas for gold. His career, his reputation, and perhaps even his life depended on the steady flow of glittering dust from his camp back to the royal treasury. This immense pressure from above was transferred directly downwards, onto the backs of the men who toiled under his command. He was the master of their world, holding the power of life and death. His quarters were the largest in the camp, his rations the most generous, his authority unquestioned. He was supported by a cadre of military guards, often veterans of the pharaoh's campaigns, who were loyal only to him and the state he represented. This military presence was not subtle. The guards patrolled the walls, stood watch at the gates, and moved through the camp and the mines, their spears a constant reminder of the camp's true nature. They were there to prevent rebellion, a prospect that, while unlikely given the workers' weakened state, was a constant fear. More pressingly, they were there to enforce the pace of work. The primary tool of this enforcement was the whip. The image of the overseer with a whip is a stereotype, but it is one rooted in a grim reality. Egyptian art from many periods depicts taskmasters beating laborers, and there is no reason to believe the remote and brutal world of the mines would have been an exception. The whip was not just an instrument of punishment, it was a tool of communication, a way of urging on the exhausted, of correcting the clumsy, and of terrorizing the defiant. A man who faltered in his work, who dropped his basket, or who simply did not move fast enough, could expect the immediate searing pain of the lash across his back. This casual brutality was a part of the daily soundscape of the camp, a constant reminder that the workers were not viewed as human beings with limits, but as recalcitrant animals to be driven. The threat of the whip was a powerful motivator, forcing men to push their bodies far beyond the point of exhaustion, to work through pain and injury, lest they attract the overseer's unwanted attention. Discipline was absolute and justice was swift and summary. There were no courts, no trials, no appeals in the desert. The overseer was the law. For minor infractions, the punishment was the whip. For more serious offenses, such as fighting, theft of rations, or organized insubordination, the punishments would have been far more severe. Flogging posts, where a man could be tied and beaten senseless, were likely a feature of every camp. Mutilation, such as the cutting off of a hand for theft or the nose for other crimes, was a recognized punishment in the Egyptian legal system and would have been a powerful deterrent in the closed world of the camp. For the ultimate crime, attempting to escape, the punishment was almost certainly death. An escapee would be hunted down by the guards or, more likely, would be claimed by the desert itself, his body left as a stark warning to others. The desert was the ultimate prison wall, a far more effective barrier than any stone fortification. The overseers knew this. The constant threat of a lingering death by thirst in the wilderness was perhaps the most powerful tool of control they possessed. The system's control was not just physical, it was psychological, built upon a foundation of constant surveillance. The scribes, with their meticulous records, were a key part of this. They tracked every aspect of the camp's life, turning human activity into data. A man's existence was reduced to a series of marks on a shard of pottery. The number of baskets he carried, the amount of ore he produced, all of this was likely recorded. A drop in a man's productivity would be noted, and he would be singled out for punishment or extra labor. This constant accounting created an atmosphere of pervasive anxiety. The workers knew they were being watched, measured, and judged at all times. There was no place to hide, no moment of privacy. This surveillance extended to the social dynamics of the camp. The overseers would have relied on a network of informants, rewarding men who reported on the conversations or plans of their fellow workers. This would have sown deep seeds of distrust, making any form of organized resistance nearly impossible. A man's closest companion, the one with whom he shared his meager rations and whispered stories of home, could also be the one who betrayed him to the guards for an extra piece of bread. This atomization of the workforce, this breaking of the bonds of trust, was a deliberate and effective strategy of control. To reinforce this earthly authority, the overseers would have also leveraged the power of religion and superstition. The desert was seen as a place of dangerous spirits and chaotic forces. The official presence of priests or lectors was not just for the well-being of the workers, but was also a tool of the state. The priests would perform the rituals necessary to placate the gods and protect the camp, reinforcing the idea that the entire enterprise was under divine sanction. The pharaoh's name was invoked constantly. The mine was his property, the gold his divine right. To work in the mine was to serve the god-king. To shirk one's duty was not just a crime against the overseer, but an act of impiety against the pharaoh and the gods themselves. Myths and legends would have circulated through the camp, tales of what happened to men who defied the will of the gods in this sacred and dangerous land. A rockfall in the mine would be interpreted not as a geological event, but as divine punishment for some transgression. This fusion of state power and religious ideology created a powerful narrative of obedience. The workers were trapped not only by stone walls and armed guards, but by a worldview that positioned their suffering as a necessary, if unfortunate, part of the cosmic order. Despite this overwhelming system of control, the human spirit's desire for autonomy could never be completely extinguished. While large-scale rebellion was likely impossible, small acts of resistance would have been a part of daily life. Workers might feign illness, deliberately break their tools to gain a few moments of rest while they were being repaired, or work at a slightly slower pace when the guards were not looking. These were tiny, almost invisible acts of defiance, but they were a way of reclaiming a small measure of control over one's own body and time. The most dramatic form of resistance was escape. Though the odds were slim to none, the dream of escape must have been a constant, flickering hope in the minds of many. Stories, whether real or legendary, of men who had successfully braved the desert and made it back to the Nile would have been whispered around the fires like sacred texts. These tales, however apocryphal, were a form of psychological survival, a reminder that the camp's walls were not the entire world, that another life, a life of freedom, still existed somewhere beyond the horizon. The overseer's watch was a constant, oppressive presence, a system of control that sought to regulate every aspect of a miner's existence. It was a world built on the power of the whip, the discipline of the guards, the surveillance of the scribes, and the ideology of divine right. It was a system designed to extract the maximum amount of labor from the human body and to crush the spirit that resided within it. The silence of the desert was not a peaceful one. It was a silence imposed by fear, a quiet born of the ever-present knowledge that to step out of line was to invite swift, brutal, and final retribution. The image of the ancient Egyptian gold miner is an overwhelmingly masculine one. It is the image of a man, his body hardened by labor, swinging a heavy stone hammer in the subterranean darkness. It is a world of male prisoners, male soldiers and male overseers, a society of men exiled to the edges of the earth. But this picture, like so many from the ancient world, is incomplete. It overlooks the smaller shadows, the quieter figures who toiled not in the darkness of the mines, but under the blinding glare of the desert sun. For the great machine of gold production required more than just the brute force of extraction. It demanded the patient, painstaking labor of processing, a world of work that fell largely to those who are most often invisible in the grand narratives of history: women and children. Their presence in these desolate camps transforms our understanding of these places, turning them from simple penal colonies into something more complex and, in many ways, more tragic. They reveal a system that consumed not just the lives of men, but entire families, harnessing the labor of every age and gender in its relentless quest for the flesh of the gods. While the strongest men, the prisoners of war and condemned criminals, were sent deep into the earth to perform the dangerous work of breaking and hauling the ore, the process on the surface was a different domain. Once the baskets of gold-bearing quartz were dumped onto the stone-paved work areas, a new kind of workforce took over. This was the domain of women. Their task was the critical and physically grueling process of milling. They would sit for hours on the hard-baked ground, often with little or no shade, and begin the systematic reduction of rock to dust. Using heavy stone mortars and pestles, or more commonly, the saddle quern, they would take the sharp-edged chunks of quartz and begin to grind. The saddle quern, a tool as ancient as agriculture itself, consisted of a large, stationary lower stone with a concave surface, and a smaller, loaf-shaped upper stone. The woman would kneel before it, holding the upper stone with both hands, and used the full weight of her body to rock it back and forth, grinding the rock between the two surfaces. It was a profoundly monotonous and physically taxing motion, engaging the muscles of the arms, the back, and the core in a ceaseless, repetitive action. The friction would have been immense, the sound a constant, grating scrape of stone on stone, a sound that would have filled the air of the camp from sunrise to sunset. This was gendered labor, a division of tasks rooted in the practical, if brutal, logic of the overseers. The work of the women was seen as less dangerous than mining underground, and it did not require the same level of brute strength for lifting and carrying heavy loads over long distances. But it was in no way easy. The repetitive strain would have led to chronic pain, to arthritis in the hands, wrists, and knees, to permanent damage to the spine. And all the while they were breathing in the same fine, silica-rich dust as the men, the sharp particles lodging deep in their lungs, leading to silicosis, a slow and agonizing suffocation. The women of the camp were dying a different death from the men, not one of sudden rockfalls and tunnel collapses, but a slower, more gradual grinding down of their own bodies, mirroring the work they performed each day. Who were these women? Some were likely the wives of the scribes, soldiers, and overseers, the administrative class who were permitted to bring their families to these remote outposts. Others may have been female convicts, sentenced to the mines alongside their male counterparts. And many, especially in the long-term Nubian mining settlements, were likely local women, pressed into service, their labor just another resource to be exploited from their native land. Alongside the women worked the children. If a woman's body was a tool for grinding, a child's body was a tool for sorting and carrying. Their small, nimble fingers were perfectly suited for the task of sifting through the coarsely crushed rock, picking out fragments that were not quartz, or carrying small baskets of ore from one station to another. Their youthful energy, before it was inevitably broken by the harsh conditions, was another resource to be harnessed. We can imagine them, small figures moving through the dust and heat, their childhoods not spent in play or education, but in monotonous, essential labor. They would learn the rhythm of the camp not through games, but through work. They would learn the feel of the different stones, the weight of a full basket, the sharp crack of the overseer's whip. This was their school, the desert their classroom, and the curriculum was one of toil and obedience. The archaeological evidence for their presence is undeniable and deeply poignant. Excavations at desert work sites have unearthed the skeletal remains of children, their small bones buried in the sand, a silent testament to their presence and their fragility. Analysis of these remains sometimes shows signs of malnutrition and physical stress, evidence of a life of hard labor. In the workers' village at Amarna, a city built for a different purpose but reflecting the realities of large-scale state labor projects, archaeologists have found toys, small wooden animals, and game pieces, reminders that children lived and played even in the shadow of these immense undertakings. To find such an object in the context of a gold mining camp would be to find a heartbreaking symbol of a stolen childhood, a small spark of playfulness in a world that was defined by its utter lack of it. The presence of women and children raises a fundamental question about the nature of these camps. While many were surely temporary, brutal penal colonies populated exclusively by men, others, particularly the larger and more permanent settlements, may have functioned as multi-generational family camps. A man sentenced to a lifetime of labor in the mines might have his family follow him, or he might form a new family within the camp itself. A child could be born in the desert, taking their first breath in a stone hut, their first sight the shimmering heat above the rocks. What would it mean to grow up in such a place? It would be to know a world without green fields or the cool water of the Nile. It would be to see the sun not as a source of life, but as a daily tormentor. It would be to understand from the earliest age the unyielding hierarchy of power, the difference between the guarded and the guards, the fed and the underfed. A child's world would be circumscribed by the camp walls, their future a seemingly inescapable continuation of their parents' toil. Yet even here, the structures of family life would have provided a buffer, however thin, against the brutality of the system. A mother's care, a father's protection, the bonds between siblings, these fundamental human connections would have persisted, creating small pockets of intimacy and support in a world designed to atomize and crush the individual. The labor of women was not limited to the grinding stones. Once the ore was reduced to a fine powder, it was the women who likely performed the delicate and skilled task of washing. As we have seen, this process of separating the heavy gold from the lighter sand required a careful and practiced hand. It was a task of patience and precision, qualities often associated with female labor in the ancient world. They would stand for hours at the sloping washing tables, their hands in the precious water, gently coaxing the worthless dust away to reveal the glittering treasure beneath. This was the moment of truth, the culmination of all the camp's labor. It was the women who were the first to see the fruits of all that suffering, the tiny, gleaming flakes of the divine metal. They were the midwives of the gold, delivering it from its rocky womb. This role placed them in a position of some importance. A skilled washer was a valuable asset, her ability to maximize the yield from the ore, a critical part of the camp's productivity. But this skill did not likely translate into better treatment or a higher status. In the cold calculus of the overseer, she was still just a component in the machine, her value measured only by the weight of the gold dust she could produce at the end of the day. The presence of families fundamentally changes our emotional understanding of the mines. It adds a new layer of tragedy to the story. We are no longer just imagining the suffering of individual men, but the systemic destruction of entire family units. We see the husband, emerging from the darkness of the mine, his body broken, only to watch his wife and children toiling under the same merciless sun, caught in the same cycle of labor. We see the mother, grinding the rock that her son will have to sort through, their lives intertwined in a shared, inherited servitude. This was a system that consumed the present and the future simultaneously. It exploited the labor of the parents, and in doing so stole the future of their children, condemning them to a life of illiteracy, poor health, and continued toil. The gold that was produced by this system was destined to create symbols of eternal life for the pharaoh, but it was purchased with the stolen lives and extinguished futures of the families who produced it. Theirs was an invisible sacrifice, a quiet, domestic tragedy played out on a grand, industrial scale, a story that was never meant to be recorded, but one that is written in the dust and the bones they left behind in the silent desert. The desert is a keeper of secrets. Its dry air and shifting sands do not rot or decay, they preserve. They mummify not just bodies, but moments, burying the remnants of human life under a blanket of silent, patient dust. The great gold mining operations of the pharaohs, once teeming with thousands of people, have long since fallen silent. The voices of the overseers are gone, the rhythmic scrape of the grinding stones has ceased, the last fire has died down to ash. All that remains is what the desert has chosen to keep. To walk through the ruins of an ancient Egyptian mining camp today is to walk through a ghost town, a city of whispers. It is an exercise in archaeological imagination, a process of piecing together a forgotten world from the faintest of traces. The evidence is fragmentary, scattered, and often anonymous, but it is there. In the layout of a ruined settlement, in a line of graffiti carved into a rock, in the poignant discovery of a broken tool or a human bone, the ancients left behind a message. It is a message that speaks not of kings and gods, but of the quiet, everyday reality of the people who were buried in the dust long before they died. The most immediate and powerful evidence is the landscape itself. The abandoned settlements are still there, etched into the desert floor. The low, circular walls of the miners' huts remain, their stones, once piled with purpose, now slowly surrendering to gravity. One can trace the outlines of entire communities, mapping the dense clusters of workers' quarters, the more spacious foundations of the administrative buildings, and the thick, imposing lines of the great fortification walls. To stand within the perimeter of one of these camps is to feel its isolation, its deliberate separation from the outside world. You can see the strategic placement of watchtowers, the narrow, easily defended gateways. The very architecture speaks of control and confinement. Scattered across the site are the tools of the trade, silent witnesses to the labor they enabled. The heavy, rounded dolerite hammers lie where they were dropped, their surfaces worn smooth by forgotten hands. The grinding stones, the saddle querns, are often found in situ, their concave surfaces still holding a faint dusting of the quartz they pulverized 2,000 years ago. Broken pottery or ostraka litters the ground, the disposable dishware of an ancient industrial site. Each shard is a small piece of a larger story, a fragment of a pot that once held water, beer, or a worker's meager ration. These are the mundane objects of daily life, but in the profound silence of the desert, they feel like sacred relics. They're tangible connections to the people who used them, a bridge across the immense chasm of time. Beyond the camps, the mountains themselves bear the scars of this ancient industry. The entrances to the mines are still visible, dark gashes in the cliffs, leading down into the earth. The tunnels, many of them unexplored by modern archaeologists, remain as they were left, their walls still bearing the marks of copper chisels and the soot from countless oil lamps. Piles of discarded rock, the tailings from the mining process, form artificial hills, changing the natural topography of the wadis. These are landscapes shaped by human effort on a massive scale. They are the physical legacy of the immense energy that was expended here, a testament to the thousands of lives spent chipping away at the very bones of the earth. But the most personal and direct messages from the past come in the form of inscriptions. The Egyptians were a literate culture, and they left their mark everywhere. The grand inscriptions are the easiest to find. On prominent rock faces along the main wadi routes, high officials would commission formal stele, beautifully carved records of their expeditions. These are the official voice of the state. They proclaim the glory of the pharaoh, give the name of the expedition's commander, list the number of men under his command, and offer prayers to the gods for the success of their mission. They are monuments to authority, declarations of the state's power to project its will into this hostile wilderness. But for every one of these formal stele, there are 100 smaller, more personal inscriptions. These are the graffiti of the common man, scratched into the rock in a quiet moment away from the overseer's gaze. A soldier on guard duty might carve his name and title. A scribe might practice his hieroglyphs or doodle an image of an animal. A miner might simply carve the outline of his foot, a simple, poignant declaration of "I was here." These small, informal marks are incredibly precious. They are the voices of the individuals who are otherwise silent in the historical record. They give us names like Amenemhat, the soldier of the garrison, or Pesa, the scribe. While the miners themselves were likely illiterate, the soldiers and low-level administrators who lived alongside them were not, and their graffiti gives us a glimpse into the human side of the camp. They are messages of boredom, of faith, of a simple human need to leave a mark, to prove that one's existence, however harsh, had meaning. The most important single document ever discovered relating to this world is not an inscription on stone, but a drawing on papyrus. The Turin Papyrus Map, as it is now known, is a document of breathtaking sophistication. It shows a 15-kilometer stretch of the Wadi Hammamat, and it is nothing less than a detailed geological and topographical map. It depicts the hills, the roads, the location of the mine, the workers' settlement, and even a well. It uses different colors to represent different types of rock, with labels explaining their nature. It is a working document, a practical tool for the organization of a mining expedition. It tells us that the Egyptians possessed a deep and scientific understanding of their landscape, but it is more than that. On the back of the papyrus are administrative texts, notes and calculations related to the quarrying work. It is a document that captures both the intellectual and the bureaucratic reality of the mines. It is a window into the mind of the ancient scribe and the state he served, a mind that sought to measure, map, and control the world in the service of the pharaoh. The human remains found at these sites offer the most direct and harrowing evidence of all. Bioarchaeology, the study of human skeletons from archaeological contexts, allows us to read the story written on the bones of the miners themselves. The skeletons of men, women, and children have been found in simple pit grave near the camps. Analysis of these bones can reveal a wealth of information. We can determine their approximate age at death, and the evidence points to a tragically short lifespan. The bones often show signs of extreme physical stress. Vertebrae are compressed and damaged from years of carrying heavy loads. Joints show the telltale signs of severe arthritis, the result of endless, repetitive labor with the grinding stones or hammers. Healed fractures on arms, legs, and ribs speak of the constant danger of accidents in the mines and the casual violence of the camp. The teeth are often worn down to the nerves, not just from a poor diet, but from the constant grit and sand in their bread, a condition known as dental attrition. Evidence of malnutrition and diseases like anemia can be seen in the porous texture of the bone. These skeletons are silent witnesses. They do not have names, but they have stories. They tell a tale of relentless, grinding toil, of chronic pain, and of a life cut short. They are the final, irrefutable proof of the human cost of gold. The story of the past is pieced together from these disparate fragments. The archaeologist stands in the ruins of a stone hut, and imagines the family that huddled within it. The epigrapher painstakingly traces a faint line of graffiti and speaks a soldier's name for the first time in 3,000 years. The papyrologist unrolls a fragile, ancient map and sees the world through the eyes of an Egyptian scribe. The bioarchaeologist examines a fractured bone and feels a phantom echo of the pain its owner endured. Each piece of evidence is a whisper from the past. The grand narrative of pharaonic glory, of golden masks and divine temples, is built upon a foundation of these quiet, forgotten whispers. The ancients left behind a puzzle with most of its pieces missing. What we have are the edges, the faint outlines of a world of immense suffering and incredible resilience. We can reconstruct the systems of control, the methods of labor, the hierarchy of the camps, but we can never truly know the inner lives of the people who inhabited them. We cannot know their hopes, their fears, their dreams. We can only stand in the silence of the ruins they left behind, listen to the whisper of the desert wind, and try to imagine the lives of the people who were sacrificed to create the treasures of a civilization, the anonymous and tired souls whose only memorial is the dust. The life of the mine, like the life of the miner, was finite. Every vein of quartz, however rich, eventually faltered. Every seam of gold, followed with such brutal determination into the depths of the earth, ultimately thinned, scattered, and banished into barren rock. This was the final, inevitable stage in the life cycle of any mining operation: exhaustion. It was a slow and creeping death, a geological fading that brought with it a new and more profound kind of despair. For the men who toiled in the tunnels, the hardship of their labor was made bearable, perhaps, only by its tangible result: the glittering specks in the rock, the growing pile of ore, the measurable output of their suffering. But when the gold disappeared, the work became not just agonizing, but pointless. The rhythm of the hammer strikes would continue, the baskets would still be filled and hauled, but the purpose was gone. All that remained was the hollow echo of pointless toil, a grim pantomime of productivity in a dying mine. This process of exhaustion would not have been a sudden event, but a gradual decline, a geological whisper that grew into a roar of absence. The miners, who spent their days in intimate contact with the rock, would have been the first to notice. They would see the specks of Nebu becoming fewer and farther between. They would break open chunks of quartz that were once rich with promise, only to find them sterile and white. This knowledge would have spread through the tunnels like a cold dread. The overseers, driven by their quotas, would have refused to accept the truth. They would have pushed the men harder, deeper, ordering them to carve new tunnels, to chase phantom veins, to explore fissures that led nowhere. The work would become more frantic, more desperate. The whips would crack with greater frequency, as if the overseer's rage could somehow force the gold to reappear from the stubborn, unyielding stone. This period of decline would have been the most dangerous of all. Tunnels would be dug with less care, safety would be sacrificed for speed, and the risk of rockfalls and collapses would increase dramatically. The mine, in its death throes, would become even more hungry for the lives of the men within it. The final decision to abandon a mine would not be made by the miners who knew the rock, but by the scribes who knew the numbers. It would be a cold, economic calculation, made on a papyrus roll hundreds of miles away in a cool administrative office in Thebes, or in the relative comfort of the overseer's hut. The scribe would tally the inputs and the outputs. On one side of the ledger were the costs: the immense quantities of grain, water, and beer needed to keep the workforce alive, the cost of the tools, the ropes, the oil for the lamps, the expense of the military garrison and the administrative staff. On the other side was the output, the diminishing weight of the gold dust produced each month. When the line of cost rose above the line of production, when the state was spending more to keep the men alive than the value of the gold they were producing, a decision would be made. The mine was no longer a viable asset. The expedition was to be terminated. A final report would be written, the ledgers would be closed, and a royal messenger would be dispatched. The state was officially giving up on the site. The process of decommissioning a camp would have been as organized and methodical as its creation. It would not be a sudden, chaotic departure. The first priority was the recovery of all valuable assets. The gold, the entire accumulated product of the mine's final months, would be carefully weighed, recorded, and secured in locked chests under heavy guard. Every last flake of dust would be accounted for. Next, the reusable equipment would be gathered. The bronze and copper tools, which were valuable and could be reforged, would be collected. The best of the grinding stones, the unbroken pottery, the remaining stores of grain, anything that could be of use at another site would be packed and loaded onto the donkeys. The camp would be systematically stripped of its value, leaving behind only what was broken, worthless, or too heavy to move. Then came the final caravan. It would be a smaller procession than the one that arrived years or even decades earlier. It would consist of the overseers, the scribes, the soldiers, and a select portion of the workforce. The strongest and healthiest of the miners, those whose bodies were not yet completely broken, might be deemed useful enough to be transferred to another, more productive mine. For them, this was not a release, but merely a change of prisons. They would be chained together and marched out of the camp, leaving one circle of hell only to be transporting to another. As they walked away, they would look back at the familiar walls of the settlement, the place that had been their entire world, and watch it shrink into the shimmering heat of the desert, knowing that the same cycle of labor and suffering awaited them at their destination. But what of those who were not chosen for the final caravan? What was the fate of the men left behind? The state, in its cold economic calculation, had no use for them. The old, the sick, the injured, the men whose bodies had been completely consumed by the labor of the mine, were no longer assets. They were liabilities. They were too weak to work and too weak to make the arduous journey to another site. And so they were abandoned. They would be left in the silent, echoing shell of the camp, perhaps with a few days' worth of rations, perhaps with nothing at all. For these men, the departure of the last caravan was their death sentence. The camp, which had been their prison, now became their tomb. We must imagine the horror of those first few days of silence. After years of the constant, deafening noise of hammers and grinding stones, the sudden quiet would have been profound and terrifying. The abandoned would wander through the empty huts, past the silent forges and the deserted crushing stations, like ghosts in their own graveyard. They would watch the last of their food dwindle, their hope fading with the setting sun. Some might attempt a desperate, suicidal journey into the desert, hoping to reach the Nile. None would succeed. Most would simply find a patch of shade within the camp walls, lie down, and wait for thirst and starvation to claim them. The desert, which had been their workplace, would now become their final resting place, its sands their only shroud. The skeletons that archaeologists find in these places are the remains of these men, the final human debris of a closed-down industrial operation. In the weeks and months following the abandonment, the desert would begin its slow, patient work of reclamation. The wind, no longer carrying the sounds of human labor, would carry sand, piling it up in drifts against the stone walls. The flimsy brushwood roofs of the huts would collapse, leaving only the circular stone foundations. A desert fox might make its den in the ruins of the overseer's quarters. A snake might find a cool resting place in the darkness of a storage pit. The paths worn into the ground by the daily tread of thousands of feet would slowly fade, blurred by the shifting sands. The mine entrances would begin to crumble, their timbers rotting away, their dark mouths slowly choked with rock and debris. The entire site would begin to sink back into the landscape from which it had been so violently carved. It would transition from a place of industry to a place of ruin, its human story slowly being erased by the immense, impersonal forces of nature. The camp was becoming what it is today. An archaeological site, a place of whispers and questions. This cycle of discovery, exploitation, and abandonment was repeated hundreds of times across the vast expanse of the eastern desert and Nubia. The landscape is a palimpsest, written and rewritten with the stories of these mines. Some sites may have been abandoned and then reopened centuries later when a new dynasty, with new technologies or a more desperate need for gold, decided to try again. New miners would arrive to find the ghostly ruins of their predecessors' work, a sobering reminder of the long history of toil in that very spot. They would clear the old tunnels, find the broken tools, and perhaps even the bones of the men who had worked there before, and then they would begin the cycle anew, their own suffering a direct continuation of a story that stretched back into the deep past. This creates a landscape not just of ruins, but of ghosts. Each silent camp is a monument to the generations of lives it consumed. Each abandoned mine is a wound in the earth that has never truly healed. To study these places is to engage in a form of dialogue with the dead, to listen to the echoes of their labor, and to bear witness to the moment when their world finally, and irrevocably, fell silent. In a quiet room, far from the desert sun, lies the serene, golden face of a boy king. The funerary mask of Tutankhamun stares out from the past, its surface a perfect, unbroken mirror of divine light. It is the ultimate symbol of eternity, a masterpiece of craftsmanship, a vessel of immense power, crafted from the very flesh of the gods. It is a story told in gold, a story of kingship, divinity, and the promise of life everlasting. But this is only half the story. To understand it completely, we must look away from the gleaming surface and remember the world of dust from which it came. For every glittering particle that makes up that serene face, a human hand once sorted through crushed rock. For every polished curve, a human body once hauled a heavy basket from the suffocating darkness. For every ounce of its sacred weight, a measure of human life was spent, unrecorded and unremembered. The history of ancient Egypt is a tale of this profound and unsettling duality, the eternal glory of the gold, and the ephemeral, forgotten lives of the people who were sacrificed to find it. What, then, does it all mean? What is the final tally in this ancient ledger of suffering and splendor? The gold was eternal, the miners were not. This is the central, brutal truth of the entire enterprise. The Egyptians prized gold precisely for its incorruptibility. It was a substance that defied time, a physical guarantee of permanence in a world of decay. The pharaoh, by surrounding himself with gold in death, was attempting to purchase a piece of that permanence, to transform his mortal, decaying flesh into the timeless, unchanging substance of the gods. And in a purely material sense he succeeded. The gold remains. It has outlasted the king's body, his empire, his language, and his religion. It sits in a museum display case, as brilliant and untarnished as the day it was polished by a Theban artisan 3,000 years ago. But the miners, the men and women whose labor gave the gold its value, were the embodiment of impermanence. Their bodies were subject to exhaustion, to injury, to disease, and to a brutally short lifespan. Their existence was as fleeting as the desert wind. They were the ultimate disposable resource, the human fuel consumed by the engine of the state to produce an eternal product. The civilization they served was obsessed with memory, with carving names into stone to ensure they would be spoken for eternity. But the names of the miners were never carved. They were written in the dust, and the desert wind has long since blown them away. This raises a fundamental question about the nature of value. The gold had an intrinsic value to the Egyptians because of its divine association and its physical properties. But its true value, its ability to be transformed from a raw material into a sacred object, was created by labor. Its value was imparted to it at every stage of its journey. It was created by the man who struck the rock in the dark, by the woman who ground the ore under the hot sun, by the skilled washer who coaxed the glittering flakes from the worthless dust. It was created by the donkey driver, the caravan guard, the scribe, the blacksmith, and the artisan. The final glorious object, the death mask, the coffin, the amulet, was the culmination of thousands of human hours, a vast pyramid of labor with the anonymous miner at its base and the pharaoh at its apex. The great irony is that the people who created the value of the gold never shared in it. They were currency being spent to acquire it. Their lives, their health, their futures were the price paid. The gold in Tutankhamun's tomb is not just a treasure. It is a receipt, a record of a transaction in which thousands of human lives were traded for one king's hope of immortality. Let us trace the journey of a single, hypothetical flake of gold. It begins its story trapped in a vein of white quartz, deep within a granite mountain in the eastern desert, where it has rested for millions of years. Its slumber is broken by the jarring impact of a copper chisel, driven by the arm of a condemned criminal from Thebes. It is broken free, placed in a rough basket, and carried on a sweating shoulder up into the blinding light. It is then handed to a Nubian woman, who kneels before a grinding stone, and with the rhythmic motion of her body, she pulverizes its rocky prison. The flake, now mixed with a fine powder, is carried to a washing table. There a skilled woman, perhaps the daughter of a soldier, gently pours water over it, her practiced eye watching as the lighter dust washes away, leaving the small, heavy flake behind. It is carefully collected, along with thousands of its fellows, and placed in a linen bag. A scribe records its weight, his neat hieroglyphs making no mention of the hands that touched it. It is placed in a locked chest, and guarded by soldiers on a long, perilous journey across the desert, and down the Nile to the workshops of the capital. There, it is melted down in a crucible, its individual identity lost as it merges with other flakes into a molten, glowing mass. This liquid sun is then poured, hammered, and polished by a master craftsman, a man of high status and skill, who transforms it into a tiny part of a god's eye or a king's lip. The finished object is consecrated by priests, imbued with magic, and finally placed in the darkness of a sealed tomb, intended never to be seen by human eyes again. Throughout this immense journey, the flake of gold has remained itself, pure and unchanged. But the people who moved it along its path, the chain of human hands that passed it from the darkness of the earth to the darkness of the tomb, are all gone, their individual stories lost, their labor absorbed into the silent, eternal object. History is, by its nature, a story of what is remembered. We remember the pharaohs because they left behind monuments designed to be remembered. They built in stone and gold, materials that endure. Their names are carved in giant hieroglyphs on temple walls. The miners are forgotten because their lives were written in dust. They left behind no monuments, no grand tombs, no autobiographies. Their legacy is one of absence, of silence. It is only through the patient work of archaeology that we can begin to hear their whispers. By excavating the ruins of their camps, by analyzing the scars on their bones, by tracing their humble graffiti, we can start to reconstruct the world they inhabited. Archaeology, in this sense, is an act of remembrance against the current of history. It is a refusal to accept the state-sponsored narrative of effortless divine splendor. It forces us to look into the darkness behind the golden mask, to acknowledge the immense human foundation upon which the great monuments were built. It gives a voice, however faint, to the voiceless. There is a quiet dignity in this anonymous labor. The miners who toiled in the desert were not building for themselves. They were not driven by artistic passion or the hope of personal glory. They were driven by fear, by compulsion, by the simple, brutal necessity of survival. Yet, in their daily endurance, they participated in the creation of one of the world's most magnificent civilizations. They were the unseen gears in a great cosmic machine. Their suffering fueled the splendor of the temples, their labor underwrote the power of the pharaoh, and their toil produced the objects that have defined ancient Egypt in the imagination of the world for millennia. They never saw the treasures they gave their lives to uncover. The man who dug the ore for Tutankhamun's mask died more than 1,000 years before the archaeologist Howard Carter would open the tomb and gaze upon it in wonder. There is a profound and tragic beauty in this. It is the story of countless millions of people throughout human history, the farmers, the builders, the soldiers, the laborers, who lived and died in obscurity, their individual lives absorbed into the great, anonymous current of civilization. And so we are left with the gold, the dust, and the memory. The gold is eternal, but its meaning has changed. It is no longer the flesh of a living god, but a beautiful artifact in a museum, a relic of a belief system that has long since passed away. The dust of the miners has long since settled, their bodies returned to the desert that claimed their lives. But the memory of them, recovered by science and empathy, remains. Their story gives the gold a new, more profound significance. It is no longer just a symbol of divine power, but a memorial to human resilience. It reminds us that every beautiful object has a hidden history, that behind every great achievement lies a story of sacrifice. The true treasure that the desert has preserved is not the glittering metal, but the human story of the people who found it, a story of immense suffering, but also of quiet endurance, and the simple, stubborn refusal to be completely erased. The desert is silent now, the mines are empty, the voices are gone, the only sound is the whisper of the wind over the stones. It is time to let the silence settle. It is time to sleep and to carry the memory of these quiet lives, these anonymous souls, with you into the stillness of the night.